Paul, we're going to come back to you, and this one has to do with marijuana legalization. So, well, this may be the reason why. Colorado is estimating $300 million of revenue, $3.5 million in January alone from the sale of recreational marijuana. What is your stance on marijuana use in California? Should it remain solely for medicinal purposes or be legalized for recreational use? If not legalized, how should it be limited? And if so, what should be done with the money?
I haven't started yet. We are in a very fortunate position in California because we have two models that we can look at. We can watch what happens in Colorado, and we can watch what happens in Washington. And we can travel there if we want to get some. We don't know what kind of issues they're going to run into. In general, I am fine with legalizing it, but I want to wait and see how things pan out there. There's so many benefits. Obviously, the revenue piece, which you addressed. I think another huge benefit is going to be on the law enforcement side because you free up law enforcement from going after people who have some marijuana. You're going to help keep the jails, the prisons, the court system unbungled. So I think there are many benefits. What do we do with the money? I'm going to go either schools or infrastructure. I need to look at where, well, we'd have to first open up some good marijuana shops. I don't know if that's something that I can say, but, and that's all. Thanks.
Okay. Simona?
So I get a little concerned when you take, in some ways, complex issues and try and say, are you for it or against it? We want to reduce everything around quick fixes. But here's my perspective on that. I think medical marijuana actually has been proven, and it should certainly be legalized in California. There are other kinds of marijuana. There are some harmful effects of marijuana, so it's hard to say as a parent, yes, let's just legalize it. On the other hand, as an activist and someone who is concerned about communities, marijuana and the sale of marijuana has led to a situation which is the new Jim Crow. It has led to mass incarceration of young people for low-level criminal offenses. It has led to us wasting our dollars, not on our children, but on building more prisons, and that really has to stop. So we do have to tackle the issue of marijuana. I'm not opposed to it, but I'm not ready to say right at this moment, broad blank, yes, let's do what Colorado did. Thank you.
Thank you. I agree. I think it's too complex to make a decision about the legality of approving marijuana, period. But I do think that medical marijuana is certainly needed. It's something that helps folks who really need it medically. I think the issue really has to be looked at. There's too many effects of it, potential effects of a system-wide marijuana. And I agree, there's so many people in the system, in the prison system now, who have used marijuana and been charged because of that use. So I think it really needs to be looked at, the money associated with it. I think some kind of task force need to look at what the effects would be and how that money could be helpful to whatever use that it could be used for. Thank you.
I would agree with everyone else on the panel that first I think we should look, we have 2 samples, we should take a look at the model and see how it grows, but it would be hard to deny that kind of money to come into our infrastructure. My concern though would actually rest more on the legalization of marijuana, would much more be on, do we have a way to test, not unlike drunk drivers? How do we test to make sure that there are no effects on people's driving skills, and how are we going to measure and manage that? But other than that, I would have to say that I'm with the other ladies here in saying that we need to see what the models end up looking like.
Okay. So, is mic working?
Yes, I think so.
Okay, good, because you've got the next question first. And this issue has been of high interest of many people in this club. So, it involves Ballona Creek. And the California Department of Fish and Wildlife and other government agencies are considering plans that would significantly alter the Ballona Wetlands Ecological Reserve, which is public land set aside for the protection of ecologically sensitive species. These plans would use bulldozers to move millions of cubic yards of earth and remove the current flood control levees that contain Ballona Creek. Also, as part of these plans, the Annenberg Foundation would lease long-term land within the reserve to build an educational center that would also include facilities for a dog and cat adoption program. The Department of Fish and Wildlife says these plans are needed to restore and enhance the reserve. Opponents, including the Sierra Club, strongly disagree, saying that these plans will harm the habitat and the endangered and native species living there. What is your position on Ballona? And if elected, what would you do to ensure that your position prevails?
Let me just start with, I love a 2-minute question where you only get a 1-minute answer, okay? I am not in favor of the official plan that would include bulldozing, that would include an animal reserve. Many people in this community have fought for a very long time to preserve the natural resources for ecological purposes, for the birds, for the fauna, for the flora, and I would not be in favor of it. I would say, though, I don't think, again, you can just throw out and have these sort of mass statements, I'd never do this or I'd never do that. The current plan is not acceptable. Whether or not there could be a plan for restoration that is far less intrusive, you have to keep an open mind about that. Preservation is important. If there is a way that meets the goals of preserving the ecological framework there and is not intrusive and would benefit the community and the wetlands, then we should take a look at it. We shouldn't close our mind to all solutions, but this one is not one I could support.
Okay. Gloria?
Yes, the Ballona wetland is really a very important issue, not only to this community, but to the state. I think what I read was that I think it's the only coastal marshland in the state of California, and I know it was purchased by the Department of Fish and Wildlife. But I think the first priority is that we restore it as much as we can to its original habitat and maintain it. I think that is very important. I do not support the Annenberg Foundation in terms of wanting to build an animal adoption there. I think you need to preserve it for the natural animals and wildlife that's there. So I think it's important that we protect it and support it, and whatever legislation is needed to do that, then I would certainly do that. Thank you.
So my street actually ends at the Ballona wetlands in the marina, so I actually have a real affinity for it. Nothing to me says restore like bulldozing. I mean, that makes no sense to anyone with any logic. So for me, obviously preserving it, I do want to educate my community on it. I spoke to the Sierra Club about this. I would like the community to understand it, understand the wildlife that exists there. We are having a problem in the marina where we have a lot of homeless moving into the wetlands. I'd like to try to see what we can do about handling that. But absolutely, you know, it is essential to preserve the wetlands, restore them responsibly, but bulldozing is not a way to restore. Not at all.
So I agree, and I would certainly be in favor of this Sierra Club in this case. One of the biggest problems that I could foresee happening is that it starts with a dog and cat pet adoption center, and then people kind of forget that these are wetlands, and they realize that the paths are getting worn a little bit more because of the foot traffic. Before you know it, there's a plan on the books to build a house or two. And I think that's the big problem when you start introducing any kind of construction into that area, that it is a gateway to I guess putting up Playa Vista Phase 4 or whatever we're up to now. So, but I love Playa Vista, don't get me wrong, but I think those two tracks need to stay untouched at this point. So I got time to spare. All right.
Okay. Looks like Gloria, we're coming back to you. And this is a nursing question. The nurse-to-patient ratio law set minimum staffing ratios in an effort to reduce the risk of harm to patients posed by inadequate staffing levels. It has been evidenced that non-compliance with the law is a frequent occurrence in most hospitals. Violations are reported and hospitals are cited, but given the lack of strong enforcement mechanisms in the law, many hospitals are frequent repeat offenders. Please explain what kind of enforcement measures you would support and what measures you would take to assist the Department of Health Services in enforcing the law.
Thank you. For one thing, hospitals are accredited. And if there are violations, and if one of those violations is continuous in terms of not being in adherence with the nurse-patient ratio, then that's a violation, and that hospital could lose its accreditation. But legislation has to be enforced. It has to be language in there that it can enforce whatever issue it is, whether it's enforcing nurse-to-patient ratio or whatever the issue is. So it would be important to me to make sure that whatever the issue is, I would research it, talk to folks who are involved with it, come up with solutions, and then craft legislation that would address those issues.
This issue is actually incredibly important to me. I'm endorsed by the California Nurses Association because it is so important to me. First of all, the fines aren't enough. You know, the hospitals do get fined when there's not proper nurse-to-patient ratios, but the fines aren't enough to really hold them accountable. I think we need to make a safe environment for the nurses to be able to turn in the hospitals so that they don't have to worry about losing their jobs, losing time on the job, or anything like that for turning in the hospitals. That's the first step. And then the second step is either to elevate the fines so that they do hurt, or obviously put their accreditation in jeopardy.
I agree with that point that it's important to make sure that nurses have a venue if they do want to be a whistleblower when something like that's taken place. So I think that's a very important piece to make sure that our hospitals remain properly staffed. I think in general, though, the problem a lot of times starts at the top. Finding a hospital is not going to get the message across to the management. A lot of times they need to be held more completely accountable. I do think, though, that on the horizon things are going to change, and I think they're going to change because of the American Affordable Care Act. I think that's going to bring a lot more people into the healthcare system for whatever reason, whether it's preventative or because of specific health issues. I think you're also going to hopefully we'll start seeing more money coming into the hospitals, and we'll see more people getting hired on as nurses or technicians. I mean, that's it. I'm sorry, I can't finish.
So I see a lot of nursing home injury, nursing home abuse, nursing home neglect cases in my 20 years as a lawyer. This is an important issue. The staffing issue actually creates safety issues, not just for patients, but actually for the nurses themselves, especially in psychiatric hospitals. So your question was about enforcement. We have regulations, and the truth of the matter is regulations do not work. And they really don't work as an enforcement mechanism because there's no one enforcing them. Fines don't work, and fines don't work because it just becomes a cost of doing business. They actually do mathematical calculations where they figure out if we get this many fines, it's going to cost this much, and we need to add that to the bottom line. One of the things that we haven't talked about, but this implicates, is MICRA, which is in California. MICRA is a law that protects bad doctors, allows them to hurt people, allows them to kill people, and be shielded from any responsibility. I know it's not popular, but it is the reality. If people are hurt in a nursing home, the limits of what their family or anyone could ever recover in our legal system is $250,000, and it is unfair.
Okay. Okay, next question goes to Autumn, and it has to deal with Proposition 13. And could you please tell us your opinion on Proposition 13? And would you seek to revise it or amend it by supporting legislation to create a split property tax roll?
So it's incredibly important for services for the community that corporate tax loopholes be closed. We all lose services as a result of that. We lose services to CalWorks, we lose services to our schools. We lose a tremendous amount of money as a result of that. I do, however, think it's incredibly important if we make revisions to Prop 13 that single-family homes are protected, 1 to 4 unit buildings are protected, because a lot of people in our community use those 1 to 4 unit buildings as part of their retirement. So that's I think that it needs revision, I think it needs edits, but I think we need to keep in mind the people that need to be protected by it as well.
Paul.
I feel with Prop 13 that now is not the time to repeal it. If you look at the projections for California's GDP estimates, round about 2016, our growth is going to be fairly strong. Not that we're ever any good at forecasting, but if that comes true, I would say probably within 18 months to 24 months is the kind of the time frame that I would look at doing something with it. But in general, I don't want to raise taxes on houses because it makes it more expensive for first-time homeowners. You mentioned the single home, the single house. I agree with that. Single-family home should be exempted. But it kind of goes to the bigger question, which is this explosion of student debt. And we're seeing the statistics are showing that a lot of first-time home buyers are not young people. And part of the reason is that they have this overhang of debt, of student debt, and it's really bogging them down. So to answer your question, I think Prop 13, maybe in a year or two we could relook at it, but right now is not the time.
So from my perspective, Proposition 13 is about fundamental fairness, and I believe it's actually related to Citizens United, and here's how. Corporations have said in Citizens United that we are the same as individuals and we can give money to political campaigns. In the case of Proposition 13, large commercial properties are owned by corporations. They are exchanged and transferred from one corporation to another by the exchange of stock and stock ownership. It does not trigger a tax event, and thus as a community, when that transfer occurs, we are losing millions upon billions of dollars in property taxes that could go to our schools. So I would say when I look at the issue as it relates to Proposition 13 and commercial buildings, that they should be treated as a matter of fundamental fairness, the same as individual property owners are treated, and we should use that money to fund these other vital things that we care about in our community.
Proposition 13 certainly provides funding for communities, for cities, and so forth. But I do think it needs to be looked at in terms of making sure that it's applied fairly. I agree that corporations should pay more taxes than the average homeowner. It's very difficult for people now to own homes, and if you, if that's there, and you have to consider that when you're paying your bills every month, then it's very important. But I support a two-tier system in terms of its application, so I think we do need to look at it. Thank you.
Okay. So we're going back to Paul, and this is a question on the war on poverty. And the war on poverty was started 30 years ago, but it's only gotten worse. In Los Angeles, there are 58,000 homeless, of which 8,000 are vets. There's minimal affordable housing, and more people today are making minimum wage than ever before in history. SB 1818 offers incentives for building low-income housing through density bonuses, but it's not an ideal solution. If elected, what ideas would you bring to the Assembly that could help turn around the war on poverty? And specifically, what would you do if elected to address the lack of low-income housing and get people off the streets?
It is a huge problem, and as a veteran, it disturbs me that anybody is homeless, living on the street, but it always concerns me that we have such a high level of people who are vets. A lot of the people who are homeless we're going back 25, 30 years ago when the administration, I think it was Reagan, did a lot to cut the budget, the funding for mental health homes. I would want to reinstill that to bring people back in who are on the street if they are screened and they do have mental disabilities. I think in general, though, we need to make sure that, like going back to the Playa Vista development, Playa Vista had certain number of homes that were required to go to low-income people. And I think that model works. I think that model is fair. I think whenever we build new homes, that has to be taken into account. And in general, I want to go back for 2 seconds to the infrastructure idea, because I think once you get more jobs, and they're good paying jobs, and you invest in people, you're going to see that a lot of the other jobs are going to be able to lift people up in general.
Okay.
Thank you. The war on poverty is in part dealt with by creating living wage jobs, by putting people back to work. That's one thing in our communities. There's a debate right now about minimum wage jobs, but we need living wage jobs. There are a lot of people who have 2 and 3 jobs who are still living in poverty, and as the wealthiest nation in the world, we need to address that, and there is really no excuse for it. The homeless issue, though, is also complex. There are a variety of reasons for homelessness. There is mental illness. There is, however, families who are the working poor sleeping in their car. There is a lack of affordable housing. And so to again, take an issue like homelessness and suggest that we can have one-size-fits-all solutions when it is actually multi-layered and multi-tiered. We have to figure out, and we have to address them in their segments and get people off the street. We are the wealthiest nation, and we can solve that problem if we put our minds to it.
Poverty is an issue that we all have to address, not just candidates or legislators, but the whole community. Prop 18 really has to do with development, and it really, what it did was change the planning and zoning law, I believe, that for developers in terms of encouraging developers to come into cities. And there's a formula where I think 5% of the building has to be for low income and 10% for moderate. And that's great. But you really have to look at the impact, whether it's traffic or how it impacts your entire community infrastructure and so forth. But we have to address homelessness, homeless people. We have to do that. We cannot ignore them. So Prop 18, Senate Bill 1818 is very important. We have to make sure it's applied in a community that makes sense. We have to involve the community to see what some of the issues are, because we just have to make sure that we address the homeless issues in this city.
So the war on poverty started about, the actual war on poverty started about 50 years ago, and at that time it was 1 in 5 people living in poverty. Today it's 1 in 4. That is not progress. SB 1818, although important to create affordable housing, unfortunately the way it's written now tends to have a net loss on affordable housing. It doesn't address rent control, which we do have in our community, and losing those units when builders come in and build. It doesn't address parking. Well, actually, you lose parking. You lose open space with SB 1818. So although it had good intentions, it really did, to bring affordable housing to the community, it needs a lot of refinement and it needs a lot of work. Also, local councils lose the ability to regulate on SB 1818, so we need to rework SB 1818.
Okay. Okay, so next question, we'll start with Simona. The legislature is often asked to reduce or increase the power of the California Coastal Commission by giving more money or less for enforcement. The incoming speaker, Tony Atkins, has a bill to allow the commission to levy fines against people who do not allow beach access or overbuild. What are your thoughts or positions, ideas, about the California Coastal Commission and its scope?
So first, when you think about the California coast, which for me, coming from Chicago, was one of the most beautiful things I've seen. It is our right as citizens, I think, to have access to the coast. So that's the general position that I have. But I think when you ask a question about more money or less money for the coast, more money or less money for building, all the things we've been talking about, what you realize is that what people do in Sacramento is they make choices, they make value judgments in how we spend our money. Whether we spend our money on children, whether we spend our money on enforcement of the coast, whether we spend our money on elderly people, whether we spend our money on homelessness. That is really what we do. So it's hard to answer actually these complex questions in a minute, but what I will remind everybody is what you want to think about in a candidate that represents you is someone who is going to stand up, have your values, be that person who opens her mouth and says, this is what is important to my community, and I will either support it because it supports the community, or I will not support it because it is completely contrary to our values.
You know, I totally support what Simona just said. I mean, these are issues that are complex. The Coastal Commission certainly has authority to do certain things, but when you look at our beaches, I mean, California has some of the most beautiful beaches in the world, and so if people can't have access to beaches, that's crazy. So, but the real issue is that there are so many things that impact people in this district or wherever that your legislator really needs to come out and talk to whatever group that has an issue. You really need a person who is willing to meet with you, hear your issues, and go back and do the things that you sent them there to do. They have to be accountable to what you want. I would be there to represent you, not to represent my interests. And I think that's what's important. You cannot just answer questions, give opinions about things that you're not quite sure about. That's why it's important to evaluate it. Thank you.
My mom used to have a foster care program in the county of Los Angeles. And we used to take foster kids from the inner city and bring them to the beach. And what most people don't realize is a lot of kids from the inner city have never seen it. And so for me, access to the beaches is important. It's not, yes, there's other things that are important as well, and that's part of being a legislator, is understanding that there's lots of things that need to be taken care of. But access to the beach is one of them. It brings hope, and it is why people come from Chicago and come and move here. And for our underserved communities to never have had access to it, to never have seen it, I think is a tremendous disservice to our community.
So access to the ocean is a public good. It's an open space. It needs to remain that way. A lot of reasons for that, but I think one that we overlooked very often, if you look at California's history, we're basically 5 industries that have built us up. Entertainment, aerospace, technology, agriculture, and tourism. You start closing the beaches off, there will be an impact. So I think for us as citizens, there's no way I would support it, but also from the economic point of view, I would not support it either. So, no.
Okay, so Gloria? Undocumented residents can now apply for a driver's license and work the polls on Election Day, as well as sit for the California bar. Would you support legislation that would allow residential non-citizens to vote in local, county, and state elections?
You really are asking very important questions tonight, complex questions. This whole issue of undocumented residents, it's a real complex issue. I support equality for everybody, whatever it is. If you're in this country and you work in this country, you pay taxes, I think you should have equality for any of the services that are offered to any citizen in this country, period.
Thank you.
Did that answer your question?
Sure.
I'm going to answer it quite similar. I believe in equality for for all people here. If you can come and you can fight for us and get educated here, I think you should participate in the system. I think that undocumented workers do give to our system in a lot of ways. So For me, yes, equality is equality, and that's just the bottom line for me.
I think the idea that people who are undocumented coming into the country are able to get driver's license is great, and I think that should be the standard across the board. When it comes to allowing someone who is undocumented to vote, I hesitate because as a land of laws, I think we need to make sure that those people don't vote if they're not a citizen, but they are offered the chance to become a citizen. And I think that's what the real question here needs to be, is how do we make that process make sense? Unfortunately, we are faced with a Congress right now that is partisan, gridlocked, not going anywhere. And a lot of the issues that we need to address, or that should be addressed at the federal level, end up falling on our shoulders. So I think what needs to happen is that we need to keep pressing for a path for legalization.
I think I probably start with the fundamental view that we all started as undocumented people. We came into this world undocumented. My mother is an immigrant. She came to America in 1964. She worked here. She was legal, but she worked and pursued the path to citizenship, and she is a citizen today. I have spent my life fighting for people's rights and equality, and I am in favor of treating people who live here and who are here equal, and for them to come out of the shadows. But voting is a right of citizenship, and we need to create a path to citizenship so that people can be citizens, they can vote, and they can participate in our democracy and make the important decisions that citizens make about what direction our country is going to go in, what direction our state is going to go in. I'm not saying that should be a hard path, but step one, bring people out of the shadows. Step two, let's know who they are and give them a real path to citizenship.
Okay, Autumn. What skills, knowledge, and/or accomplishments do you bring to the table that your opponents do not? And why do they make you best qualified for the 62nd Assembly District seat?
All right, so I have a few things. I believe that I have financial experience. I've done public-private partnership. I've worked on billion-dollar deals. I also believe that a lot of the issues that are coming up for this district now I have an experience in. Like I said, land use density is going to be a big issue for this district coming up. And I'm passionate about this district. I live here. I love it here. I understand what's happening here. I understand the traffic issues, and I understand the growth issues that are impending here. So I think that gives me a great step ahead. Also, I'm impassioned about representing the entire district. It's a complex district, and I think it's tremendously important for whoever has this seat to not only understand the issues that are involved with the urban portions of this district, but also the coastal portions of this district, and that is a priority for me. Thank you.
I haven't started yet. Okay, so as a teacher, obviously I feel well informed about educational issues. I think I bring that to the table. I also think, though, that at my age, I am smart enough to know when I don't know enough. And I also have a pretty good idea about what kinds of questions need to be asked if I don't know which direction we need to go in. A lot of that comes from failing, and I hate to admit that, and I think that, please turn that off. But a lot of lessons have come from that, and I can confidently say that as an officer in the Army, as a teacher, as a businessman, I have certainly been through ups and downs, but I think in general I have learned and I have grown, and I think those are the kinds of things that have helped build my character and give me the confidence to get in the race this year, because we are facing some hugely complex times, especially when you look out 15 or 20 years, and I think everybody has to understand in government that they are all related. So it's about making those connections.
Thank you. First, the job of a California State Assembly person is to make rule of law that will cover the entire state. Professionally, I certainly have to say that as an attorney, it has been my life's work to figure out complex sets of laws, to read the fine print, to look and see what the unintended consequences are. So that's my professional skill. But I also think that you don't make those in a vacuum. That's why you send people. And so what I bring to the table is a set of personal values that people matter, that when we are making budget decisions about education, we are absolutely changing opportunities for children in our community. When we make decisions which are laws about whether or not to fully fund homeless centers, we are making decisions about our community. I understand, not only as a mother, but as someone who is here today because other people understood that what they were doing was going to impact me and either create a path to opportunity and success or absolutely leave me and my family in poverty for the rest of my entire life. I value that and I care.
Thank you. Serving in the state assembly is extremely important. It's an important position because that person does make law and it impacts the entire state. So I think it's important to have someone who would represent you who has proven leadership. I have experience as in terms of creating policy on a local level. I serve on the West Basin Water Board, so I make policy there. I'm also vice chair of Metropolitan Water District, so I create policy there as the regional policy, and I serve on the state Debt Stewardship Council. So I have experience in creating policy that impacts everyone in the state of California as it relates to water. And I think you need somebody who has that experience. It's not a place where you really kind of learn on the job. You really need to have the experience in setting policy. And also relationships. I have relationships with many people already in the state assembly. I have a proven record of community service. I serve on almost every board you can think of, nonprofit in this district. So I think that's important to send someone to Sacramento who has proven leadership and experience. Thank you.
Okay.